The International Monetary Fund says it will support a Eurozone bailout for Greece. European ministers have approved a new batch of rescue loans worth $11.5 billion. That's after Greece's parliament passed a controversial bill with measures demanded by its creditors, including more tax hikes and pension cuts. The finance minister welcomed the news. Well, the loan is the long-delayed second installment of Greece's third bailout, which was agreed back in August of last year. Eurozone ministers are splitting this payment in two. The country will get $8.3 billion in June. That will help it meet a repayment deadline in July. The other $3.1 billion is due in September. They'll go towards creating jobs and growth. Well, Greece's debt amounts to more than $357 billion. The country's economy collapsed in the wake of the financial crisis. We'll cross to Athens in just a moment, but first let's go to Kevin Osbeck, who is in Brussels for us. Kevin, those negotiations went on all night. What were the main sticking points that needed to be hammered out?
Well, yes, that's right. The talks began Tuesday afternoon and they stretched well into Wednesday morning. The Eurozone finance ministers and Greece's creditors wanted to make sure that Greece put in place a number of new austerity measures in order to get that $11.5 billion unlocked. Of course, this $11.5 billion is part of that huge $96 billion bailout package that was negotiated last summer. Greece desperately needed that money because very soon it does have some loan payment deadlines that it needs to meet. So over the weekend, the Greek parliament passed a number of these new austerity measures that are just adding up on top of the austerity measures that they've been passing for the past 7 years. And these latest austerity measures hit the Greek people quite hard. We're talking about increases on taxes for things like tobacco and fuel. But once the Eurozone ministers got together, they saw that Greece did enact these new austerity measures. They were happy with these austerity measures. They decided to unlock these additional billions of dollars. Also, what was so significant about this Eurogroup meeting was that Greece's creditors also agreed that debt relief does need to happen. Now, none of the specifics were hammered out yet, but that will be happening in the coming weeks and the coming months.
Let's talk about that debt relief, because this was pretty significant, wasn't it, for the IMF to actually approve this deal?
It's very significant. It's been very well reported that the IMF and the Eurozone finance ministers didn't exactly see eye to eye on this for some amount of time. The IMF has really been pushing for debt relief because it says Greece's fiscal projections are too zealous. They don't believe that it could ever meet all of these surplus goals. The Eurozone finance minister said, we think Greece can. Also, it's in the IMF charter that it can't help bail out a country if it believes that its debt is sustainable. But finally, there was an agreement met yesterday here in Brussels. So now we will wait and see how these creditors come together and hammer out the specifics of this debt relief. But this is exactly what Athens was hoping for. This is exactly what Athens was asking for.
Okay, Kevin, many thanks for that. Kevin Osbeck there in Brussels. Let's get the reaction from Athens. Maria Kajalidou is there for us. Maria, they are calling it a major breakthrough, this deal. How desperately did Greece need this money?
Well, it certainly did need the money. This money was supposed to be dispersed months ago. Originally, this money was supposed to be dispersed after the first evaluation of the deal agreed this summer. This was supposed to happen at the end of last year. In the next few weeks, the Greek government has to pay back both IMF loans and European Central Bank loans. It needs at least over 3 billion euros. So certainly there's this side of things, but I think the Greek economy also desperately needed this money. It doesn't necessarily need the money itself because it won't be returned to the Greek economy. It won't be thrown into the Greek economy. It will go to loan repayments or the better part of it. But what it needed was some sort of understanding that there was a deal. It needed a sealed deal because for the past few months there has been a lot of uncertainty here, and this hasn't helped things at all. Greece is back in recession, and this is making its loan repayments and fulfilling its targets even more difficult than it originally was.
Maria, more protests over the weekend. It's going to be tough for the people of Greece going forward, though.
It certainly is, and this is a tough deal. First of all, regarding this weekend, the Prime Minister is actually being called to come back to Greece and take back at least one of the promises he made to people. A promise he made to people on very, very low pensions, that they weren't going to return some of the money they received at some point. But on top of that, Greece is being called to run a 3.5% primary surplus. Now, this is a very, very high surplus. It essentially means that what the Greek money, the Greek state collects will have to be much, much more than what the Greek state spends. And this 3.5% rate is much higher than anybody thinks Greece really can achieve. At the same time, there is some sort of contingency mechanism that would push through more austerity. So I think overall, we haven't seen the end of this Greek drama yet, and nobody's quite sure that these numbers will eventually make sense.
And Maria, how important is this issue of debt relief? Because the problem seems to be for Greece is they can't seem to climb out of this vicious cycle of constant cutbacks.
Well, it is important. It's possibly not of immediate importance in the sense that there's some leeway with interest rates and some things have been delayed until after 2021. But it is very important. Everybody all along has been saying that Greece's debt isn't sustainable. The IMF has been saying it. The current Greek government has been saying it, and a lot of other people. And the Europeans, what they did yesterday was in very traditional European Union fashion, they kicked the can down the road. Now, they kicked the can down to 2018. That is a very political move. This means they won't have to make any major decisions until after the German elections. But I think also what has to be taken into account is that for the first time, we've got some sort of recognition, first of all, that debt relief is certainly needed, and secondly, that Greece's repayments have to, in some way, correspond to how the economy is doing. So there is actually a ceiling in this deal, a 15% of GDP ceiling for debt repayments. They shouldn't exceed 15% of Greece's GDP in the medium term and 20% in the long term. So there is some good news and there's some bad news, but apparently we will all have to wait and see until at least the Germans have their elections.
Okay, Maria, many thanks for that. Maria Kagaledu, our reporter there in Athens.